Welcome, everybody. It's time once again for the next chapter with Charlie Hedges as he explores turning the page on his life and yours. Hey, Charlie.
Hey, Paul. What's up?
What's up? I get to talk here? That throws me for a loop. I'm doing good. I'm looking forward. What show is this? 282 or something?
282.
Wow.
Yeah, we're closing in on 6 years of doing podcasts together.
Fabulous.
So that's wonderful. But I tell you, our show today is going to be a special show. Our fascinating guest is Linda Rossetti. Now, in her latest book, Dancing with Disruptions, Linda offers insights into the shifts that occur repeatedly when we begin to think deeply about who we are. Often these shifts are found in the way we think about ourselves, and they come as a result of challenging disruptions. Regarding disruptions, Linda writes, "Despite popular beliefs to the contrary, I have come to understand that our times of disruption and upheaval are perfectly normal, common, as well as a signal for meaningful growth." On today's show, Linda and I will spend quite a bit of time focusing on my language, not Linda's, but the power of self-talk, and now Linda's language, how you might turn up the volume on your own voice, your own healthy voice. Linda Rossetti is a business leader with a Harvard MBA. Her latest book, Dancing with Disruption, comes after a decade of research and interviews with nearly 300 people. And with all that research, Linda brings some unexpected conclusions regarding the impact of significant changes that occur to all of us. Linda is the author of 2 books, Dancing with Disruption and also Women and Transition. She hosts a podcast with a brilliant title, Destination Unknown. I love that. Her work has been featured on NPR, NBC, Money Magazine, and several other outlets. So with that, let's bring on our guest, Linda Rossetti. Welcome to the next chapter with Charlie.
Charlie, how are you?
I am good. Thank you for asking. You know, Linda, 282 podcasts, I don't think anybody's ever asked me that.
Oh, my goodness. Well, I'm happy to be here, and I would love to know the answer to that question.
Oh, well, that's a show in itself, and it would be a rather dark show.
Hard to believe, but congratulations to you and Paul on your work.
Thank you.
A wonderful podcast.
Thank you. That's so nice of you to say. You know, I really am looking to have fun today. You know, in our chat and reading through your book and my notes, there's so many wonderful ideas for us to talk about. So, Linda, I think what I'd like to do from the start is chatting to you about disruptions and how our disruptions might serve as a reminder of who we really are in our core inner self. Now, that's an unusual thought, but you really bring that to light, and I'm very much looking forward to greater enlightenment. So, let's begin with definition of terms in our title. I'm sure people have varying interpretations or definitions on what disruption is, and you have sort of a specific definition that fits your philosophy. Could you tell me what is disruption?
Absolutely, and I appreciate that you're allowing us to start here, because I think it'll help everyone kind of as an on-ramp into the conversation, right? Disruptions are all around us, right? We took 5 minutes, we could come up with a list of many, many. As you said, the disruption that I focus on in the book and in my work is really about shifts that occur in our self-concept. You know, we're not really talking about the disruption that happens on the way to the office or on some other event where there's a break in the action, but we're quickly able to reset. Disruptions that I'm most concerned about or most interested in are those that really have to do with our thinking about who we are. And they very often express themselves when either we're on the heels of something unexpected that's happened, like perhaps a layoff or, the loss of someone special, or something that's expected, like, perhaps a milestone, like a special birthday or retirement, an empty nest, or even and we have a realization, like all of a sudden we might one day say, well, wait a minute, losing my way, who am I? Right? All of these kind of initiating circumstances can bring us to what I call a disruption, which is really when we come to realize there's a shift, some kind of break in our thinking about who we are, self-concept.
I really identify with that and like that very much. It has, but the disruptions, are they typically significant disruptions or everyday sort of, this is not the way I planned my life to be, or is it a combination of both?
So it's a great question. It really, after talking with hundreds of people about how disruptions express themselves in our lives, the answer is it can be any and all of the above, right? For some person, a chance headline in the supermarket checkout line can, cause a significant response. And for someone else, it's something that, is perhaps, more complex and involved. But really, the work that I do is really focused on not so much identifying the initiating circumstance, which can be a wide variety of things. What I'm really interested in is the impact. So if whatever occurs, right, whatever your initiating circumstance is, it can be a feeling, it can be an event, it can be a realization. But when any of those things impact our thinking about who we are, or there's a shift in how we think about ourselves, I'm all ears, right? Because what I've found in my research is those moments really signals that allow us to respond differently. If we respond differently, my research told me that we can really have an incredibly positive impact on our lives. And it's not something that we talk about. In fact, it's much impolitic in life to think about disruptions in these ways. We're almost conditioned to kind of like tamp down or run the other way when we have questions about who we are, and yet it's those questions that if we can honor them and bring some new thinking to it, we can alter the trajectory of our lives in a very positive way.
Yeah, I'm thinking that these disruptions can challenge our deeply held status quo, that we are sort of locked into who we are, and a disruption, if accessed well, will show us there's indeed a shift in I don't know if there's a shift in our core self, Linda, as much as in a shift in our perception of our core self, that we see.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Go ahead. I'm so sorry.
Oh no, we just see a different side, to the story, and we're a rough cut diamond with many facets.
So true. I love your picture of the diamonds and all the facets, and you make me think of this set of definitions. Right? You started us off with definitions, and there's two others that I think are worth introducing into our conversation, because when disruptions occur, it's oftentimes interesting to think about, well, how do we respond? Sometimes we can feel forced to respond in a certain way. And what I learned when I spoke with all these folks, and afterwards, after I finished talking with all these people, I went and scoured kind of the science of human development and all the scholarly research, and I found that at moments of disruption, there are two words that we often interchange in our society that mean very different things. Those words are change and transition. And in the wake of a disruption, when we kind of choose change, what's happening is we're pursuing kind of a goal-oriented outcome. We may be changing a job, we may be finding a new apartment, making a geographical move, but really what we're doing is we're leaving intact our self-concept. We're making variations or alterations kind of break the disruption. But that's very different, than what is happening when we pursue a transition in the wake of a disruption. Because transitions occur when there's a shift, what holds value and meaning to us. What it invites us to do is to welcome instability for a time in our self-concept. But really, what's happening is that, instead of a fixed self-concept that we're kind of supporting through a change effort, transitions really are about unknown outcomes, right? But what it invites us to do is to re-examine the assumptions upon which we anchor our self-concept. So, yeah, what you're referring to is, our perception of, even our awareness of who we are and what those beliefs are that kind of anchor ourselves. That might be part of the whole process, right? We may have to really come into thinking about what that is. And it's really a fascinating process. I remember there was this one woman in my research, her name was Lakshmi, excuse me, and she was somebody who was in her mid-30s. She said, all of a sudden, I'm kind of stuck. She had pursued a lengthy MD, PhD program and was working in an academic medical center in the Midwest in one of the Big Ten universities. She said, I realized all of a sudden, this isn't who I want to be. She said, I've never even dreamed outside of what this is. And she said, to your point of perception, she said, I wasn't really aware of this. I kind of, had some instincts, but I just kept pushing things to the back of my mind. And she said, ultimately I kept getting these debilitating headaches. She said, I really came to ask, what does my body know that I'm not aware of yet? I just share that story to say that, we can arrive at a disruption with a variety of awareness to where we are and how we think about ourselves. But what I've come to learn is that these disruptions are really invitations, even though we rarely think of them that way. Invitations to kind of explore who we are and how we make meaning in our life. And I think therein is the richness, right? We can choose change, and by the way, change is never easy, but we can also choose transition, which tends to be really an opening in our self-concept.
Well, they are two important concepts, and change, not all change needs to be a transition, but certainly the most impactful and meaningful change is a transition, is a moving forward, is a growth. And I think all of it for that introspective seeker that wants to embrace a more meaningful life, that transition to another state is really very good. It's like the paradigm that got you here won't get you there. There comes for a whole reordering, and I think the kind of disruption and upheaval and change you're talking about is a complete reordering, maybe not a complete, but a significant reordering to the way we will talk later, what adds value to me, and who am I at my core identity. And I think, Linda, don't you think that is almost rare for most people to think about, that we just live in the day-to-day and don't really contemplate it that much?
It's so interesting. Yes, I think you're right. And it's funny because I think we are, our society, we're socialized to kind of hang on tightly to, an initial identity. And when we let go or decouple from that, we're used to hanging all sorts of negativity on that. We were quickly saying, oh, I failed, or I have some deficit, or I can't, and really that kind of meaning is misplaced when we think about really what transition represents, because it is an opportunity to kind of turn up the volume on our own voices. And by voice, I don't mean what you audibly hear from me. I mean what you're referencing, which is really this opportunity to kind of recenter on those things that are meaningful or valuable to us and who we are uniquely. And I love that your notion of introspection, because as I thought about how to write this book, Dancing with Disruption, I figured the workbook would probably be a whole lot better than a book, and so it's kind of a fusion. And in each of the chapters of the book, there are exercises that really are for self-reflection, and it's to help somebody who's going through this to make progress on the categories that presented themselves in the research that I did. And there's this very, very smart lady, her name was Ravenna Helson, and she did work at UC Berkeley for many years, and her work was all on this notion of how our identity shifts change throughout our lives, right? It can happen at 22, it can happen at 72, or it can never happen. And what she used is she used this beautiful word, recentering, because when we get to these moments of growth, there's some things, in our self-concept that we hang on to. It isn't as if we're going to throw the baby out with the bathwater. We re-examine, and some things we hang on to, and some things we introduce are new, and some things we turn up the volume on something maybe we didn't foster in the past. So it really is this entire recentering of those things that are almost the composite of how we think about ourselves.
Linda, I have lived a life of transition and new thoughts and new identities, and as I said, I probably have had 7 careers in my life. But as I approach 74, one tends to exaggerate where one is presently, but I feel like this is the most significant transition I've ever gone through. I can't identify any specific upheaval, but there was a dissatisfaction and a knowing that there was greater growth, and it came from a book that I read, Falling Upward by Richard Rohr, and he talks about 2 halves of life. Are you familiar with it?
I am, yes.
Oh, yeah. Well, he talks about the first half of life, which is essential, and that's, up to around 50 or so, and you are, as is necessary, you're building an ego, and you can't, the mystics will say you have to abandon your ego. You can't abandon your ego if you don't have an ego. And those boundaries, that ego helps establish confidence, understanding of myself. But as we move into this second half, that ego is no longer important, and that ego must actually be lost and must be transitioned into a half that is open, that is not dependent on me, that is not dependent on my identity of myself, because I already understand myself, I'm comfortable. Now I need to know how to come into the world. Did that thing make any sense to you?
Sure, and it is. That book and many others really talk about this progression through adulthood, and the scholarly research is cautionary on stages, right? Because it's been proven that depending on what happens, your lived experience, such an advancement, to that second half, as he's referring to, can happen at 22 or at 74 or never, right? Many people kind of stay with a single self-concept for their lives. And so I'm always cautionary on thinking about stages, because some people in listening are like, oh my goodness, I never went through that stage. What should I do? There must be something wrong. I think that the theories that he's introducing and what we can learn from just developmental progression are important, because they can help us ask new questions, right? And some of the work that I've also really enjoyed that you might know of is Robert Keegan, who's out of the education school at Harvard, or Jack Mesereau, who's out of Columbia, who's now deceased, but a really great contributor to the field. So they said that we go through these progressions, like when we enter adulthood, right? We define who we are, what's around us, by external. So, communities we live in, the work we choose to do, our families, our religious affiliations, the racial, ethnic connections that we have, right? So we kind of create this sense of who we are by drawing from all these external influences. As you noted, as we progress through life, and sometimes it's at the half-life or at other times, we have this opportunity to say, for that assumption, I always thought I was going to be a general manager by the time I was 35. You know what? That doesn't hold water anymore.
No.
So we take those assumptions and we refine them. And second kind of plateau that people get to is when really say, well, now this identity that I have is really self-defined. It's really those things that hold value and meaning to me. Because if somebody continues beyond that, generally believe that they get to this kind of state that you so beautifully describe, which is, a connection to a greater humanity. It isn't necessarily defined by my beliefs or your beliefs. It's kind of a connection to a whole and a willingness to not only contribute but impact that. So it's really, disruption can happen anywhere along that progression, right? It can happen when we're, we're just starting out in early adulthood, and it can happen we're well into our 70s and 80s, and really thinking about the boundaries we might have once set for ourselves and our understanding of the world, and going through them. saying, wait a minute, I'm opening, there's more here. Wow.
Oh yeah, I'm reading. I don't know if you're familiar with Rick Rubin's new book, The Creative Act: A Way of Being, and he talks very much about that transitions occur. Stages, if stages are predictable, if they're too limiting, then they're not helpful. But stages of, just kind of at a high level explaining growth can be helpful. They're not definitive, but they can be helpful. And we are in a process of transition. We are in a process of growth. We're in a process of learning. And I think more and more of us really need to embrace that idea. Now, as I was reading some of your materials, I noticed that you write about the reality of uncertainty in my life, in our lives. Tell me about uncertainty and how uncertainty helps us in understanding the kind of transitions we need to go, because our staid beliefs are challenged. They are no longer certain. And even our theological beliefs, as so many people are talking about God and Christianity today, very, very, very fundamental beliefs are being challenged and wondered about. And I happen to look at uncertainty as good. Did I catch that right in your writing, that uncertainty is important to you?
Oh, absolutely, and I'm smiling. That's the one thing that this medium challenges us. We can't share our smiles when we're listening to people talk. Uncertainty is constant, and really is something that, again, I use in the work as a signal to invite us more. And many of us really encounter emotions of pretty significant magnitude when we're wading through uncertainty. And I spend a fair amount of the book talking about how to reframe those emotions, that we can be with uncertainty, not have it serve as an oppositional force in our life.
Right.
But, there's a lot of times when we're not going to know the answer. Beauty is if we can get to a place where even in unknowing, we're not stopped. And a fair amount of the research that I did really led to this notion of needing to externalize our emotions, and that may be something that you've talked about on the show. I've listened to a few, but I haven't gone through all 282. Externalizing means we really try to remind ourselves that we are not the emotion. The emotion is the emotion, right? So we are not fear. We are not, maybe countering fear, feeling fear. We are not, it's not a character trait. We are not fearful, right? So that impermanence in reminding ourselves with techniques or other ways to deal with uncertainty changes its profile radically, right? I often describe it that, Charlie, if you and I went outside and I said, okay, Charlie, let's draw that skyscraper that's across the street, you would render it in the best way you could. And then if I said, okay, let's go up the elevator in the building that's across from it and go to the roof, if I asked you to draw that same skyscraper, it'd be from an entirely different standpoint.
Mm-hmm.
That's what I try to do with the emotions that come up with uncertainty, right? That if we can embrace ways to help us reframe, to look differently at uncertainty, we can really have an entirely different conversation with ourselves. And I think that's the key, right? Because, this stuff is not easy, right? If we wake up, at 72 or 4 or 8 and say, wait a minute, I missed that entire, chapter. Hold on, I want to try this differently. There's more here. That can be terrifying. And I think that that's why in the book I spend so much time on it is, it needn't stop us. And that's why there's a technique in the book called HAIL, which is an emotional reframing technique that uses each of the letters of the word HAIL to help us with prompts.
And we're going to close the podcast out on that, just to let you know, because I want to offer tools, but we are going to talk about
at any rate,
HAIL.
That, uncertainty is certainly it's a byproduct, right? In transition, we're welcoming instability, so we don't know the answers. most of the book I'm trying to diffuse fear that surrounds that and help us be okay with not knowing. And I think there's some pretty good gems in there.
It's a Japanese concept that I love, that's called wabi-sabi, and it talks about the beauty of things incomplete, impermanent, and imperfect. Those are that it sort of develops an openness, a philosophical openness to that which is perfect is not perfect. That which is, it needs to be worn, it needs to be used, it needs to be tested, and I like that. On uncertainty, I have to bring in a discussion that I just read in a Maria Popova quote, and she was writing on the popular, just recently died in 2022, philosopher and popular author Jacob Needleman. He was a professor at San Francisco State University, and there was one line of it that really resonated with me, Linda, and that was, "The disillusion of certainty is the gateway to freedom."
Oh my gosh, of course. Lovely.
Isn't that lovely? That is.
Absolutely.
Disruption inspires shifts in the way we think, and these shifts lead us to ask what you contend. Ask the question, what holds value to me? Because if I think just what held value to me a year ago, a decade ago, my values, they're very similar. We're always the same person, but what word am I thinking of? The distinctions of them are all different. They're...
Yes.
Help me.
Yes, you reminded me of a story, so maybe the story can help us. There was an interview I did that's covered in the book with a gentleman whose name is Arthur. And he started the interview with me by saying, "You see so much more now." The striking thing about Arthur is that he had lost his sight. He was completely vision impaired, and that was as a result of a degenerative condition in his eyes that in his 30s through his early 40s he lost his ability to see. I think it's so fascinating because what you're describing, Charlie, is this notion of seeing differently. And as our interview went on, he said, for the first, let's call it decade, that I was getting used to losing my sight, he said, my world became very small. The changes I made were to kind of draw inward. I felt less and less. I ultimately withdrew from the workplace. I made these changes. He said, really, my understanding now is that, thanks to transition, is that this wasn't about my sight at all. This was about how I perceive myself, I hold as valuable, and how I greet the world. He said, I can't see you. I don't know what you look like, what you're wearing. He said, but I see so much more now. And I think that is just, me, the most powerful story, because we can be like a lot of people think transition means I have to leave. I have to go somewhere new. What I've learned through my research is we can stay exactly where we are. What transition allows us to do is to see differently, through a new lens, and bring something that may be familiar into an entirely new light.
That's good, and that is so essential in life. Otherwise, we get staid and old and crotchety and unopen to new thought, different thought, challenging thought, helpful thought. But fortunately, in your formula, it is disruptions and shifts that if we pay attention and don't sit and whine about them, but if we try to learn about them, we are driven to different ways of thought.
Exactly, right? We get an openness that might not have been part of us prior, right? If we learn to respond differently, which I am hoping as people read the book or start a conversation about this with their friends, that they will have an opportunity to bring new questions to themselves. And that's the beginning of something fantastic.
We have, one last comment on this. I want to go back to Needleman's, the disillusion of certainty is the gateway to freedom. And I think that is worthy of pondering and discussing because certainty is about rules, it is about structures, it is about predictability. And if we live in the wabi-sabi where it's incomplete, impermanent, and I always lose the other M, certainty is built to be dismantled. Because if we maintain certainty, there is no creativity, there is no new thought. And what you talk about is these disruptions inspire shifts in the way we think largely about ourselves. And that shifts lead us to ask, what holds value to me today? Not what held value to me a decade ago. And typically they're not radical shifts. They're step changes, not phase shifts. They're step changes that can lead to a phase shift. But we begin to think what our value is and what's different. And
yes, it's so fascinating, isn't it? It really is. Breaks my heart that we really don't have the vocabulary for this in our kind of society. Because if we did, I think more people would kind of jump on the bandwagon. And you make me think, as you're talking about this dissolution of certainty, I come from the business world, Charlie, as you know, and there was a gentleman who I worked for many years who was the CEO of Iron Mountain, and he used to say, there are two types of leaders in this world. There are certain leaders and there are confident leaders. Certain leaders are those who know the answer. They're convinced they know the answer, and they're kind of waiting for everyone else to get to their answer. They try to apply their answer across the widest swath possible. And then there are confident leaders who are in opposition to that, who believe in people and themselves and have an openness that allows creativity and innovation to happen. And I've always held on to that because I find that, I can see that as I meet people and I talk about ideas with people, I'm not judging one or the other. I think that the challenge to all of us as we encounter disruption is to be able to ask ourselves questions about what the next step is we can take. And even if we've hung out in the world of certainty for a long time, that doesn't mean we can't benefit from exploring a little bit of what might be ahead should we choose to kind of track in a more stable, maybe impermanent way to try to kind of make a shift.
Yeah, that's where I am in life today, and that's why I'm so excited and interested in talking about part 2 after our break. So I want to move on to identifying and living by what you call, we are our own self-audience, and our voice is a sense of self-expression. And so I think, we've discussed the factors that give permission to think differently, but how do we think differently? And you have some brilliant ideas that I want to talk to. So we're going to take a brief break, and then we're going to come back and talk about that. Hi, all. This is Charlie Hedges with the Next Chapter with Charlie. I'm so glad you've joined us. And my special guest today, Linda Rossetti, is really special. She's learned, researched, interviewed, and she really works on the relationship between disruptions, the challenge of certainty, the challenge of always living life in the same mode instead of thinking, what might I do to progress to an even greater state of being? And that's what I want to talk about today. Now, you are in this half of the show. Now, you have a line that I liked. You have a lot of quotable one-liners that I love. You told me we are our own self-audience. Can you tell me about that?
Sure, Charlie. And it comes out of this notion, and we've been talking a lot about, do we pursue change? Do we pursue transition when we encounter a disruption? It can all sound great and fine, but a lot of people turn to me and say, Linda, how do you do this? Like, this is great. I'm interested. I would love to be an openness to where I am, but I'm not entirely sure how to do that. I'm not sure what's next. So there are a handful of ideas that I offer in the book, and one of them is to use storytelling as a technique to try to envision or get our arms around those things that might be emergent for us, right? The new ideas, the new things that might, we might turn up the volume on in terms of the things that hold meaning or value to us. In terms of storytelling, I often say we are our own first audience, right? So there's an imperative for us to get storytelling right, because if we say, kind of, I guess, the Eeyore syndrome, oh, I'm terrible, I can't do this, that's our story, we're going to believe it, right? So
we do believe it, yes.
We do. We believe all these self-limiting stories, and it's fascinating, I think, that we often miss the fact that we are our own first audience, and it's important to rethink. And so in the book, I talk a lot about the different types of architectures of our stories, right? Very often we're conditioned in our society to use a chronological storytelling architecture. I was A, and then I was B, and now I'm C, and I'm at D, and I'm a little lost, so I'm not entirely sure. And what chronology does at times of transition, it seems to it leaves our listener, including us, off at this break, this uncertainty. And that can be tricky to try to navigate through, because really we're looking for how to define the next adventure. And so I've found that if we practice using a different architecture, and one I'll recommend in the book is to choose one thing that holds value and meaning to us. Anything, it can be anything on the planet. If we re-architect our story around that, tell an entirely different story, and it's generative, right? We begin to see new things doing what is a very simple storytelling technique. So, I'd encourage folks that have time to head to their local library and find the book, or, choose it online wherever you get your books. But it's a fascinating, incredibly simple technique that can give us awareness, to where our voices are and how present our voices are in our own stories.
I'm reading a book now that it's very difficult to evaluate a book after you're just a third of the way through it. And I'm feeling it's one of the most influential books I have read in the last decade. It's by Rick Rubin, the great music producer. He's produced everybody in the world. And he wrote a book titled The Creative Act, A Way of Being. So creation, in his terms, is not a way of acting as much as a way of being. It is a representation of our internal selves, and he leads us to think that we are in a constant process of moving into something different and something new and something creative. I like what you talk about in light of Rick. You talk about voice, and that voice is our sense of self-expression. And I'm coming to believe, Linda, that the common trite phrase is you are what you think you are, but you really are. If you think too strongly, you limit yourself to who you think you are. and you try to put everything into that box and make it fit, and it becomes a very a box that you can't invade. You can't get inside of it because the structures around it are so tight and so deep and so strong that you can't touch who you are. But you talk about our voice as a sense of genuine self-expression. And, I have notes under that, but I want to hear your comment on what does it mean to have a sense of self-expression?
Sure, and I thank you for the recommendation on Rick Rubin's book, The Creative Act. I'm fascinated. I can't wait to
Have you read it?
I didn't know of it. I have not, so I'm really interested.
Oh, my goodness.
So
Get ready.
Excellent. So, this notion of voice, let me just give you a touch background on why it comes into the work that I do, and then I'll answer your question. Right? A lot of people, when they came into my interviews, would come in and say, I'm here because of X, and they would share, what they thought the transition was that they were going through, right? I've had a layoff. I've broken up from a marriage. I've gotten remarried. I've had a loss. I have a break in my faith or understanding. For so many different. Many had a new physical limitation, right? All sorts of things came in, and people believed that these events or circumstances were the transition. And after listening to nearly 300 in a very structured way through the research, I would tell you that while any of those things that I just described can be part of the transition, single one only common denominator to transitions is this notion of turning up the volume of our voice. Now, our voice, again, isn't necessarily what we audibly hear from someone. Like, I've been talking now for no more than 30 minutes. Clearly that I'm a Bostonian, right? All of your listeners do. It isn't really about my what you hear audibly. What it is about essence, truth. People react to that like, well, okay, that's kind of an amorphous kind of thing, and I think we are kind of taught that because very often we're conditioned, depending on where we arrive in society. Like, I worked in the corporate world in very senior positions in the corporate world for almost 30 years. And I will tell you that people looked me dead in the eye and said, we don't want to hear your voice. If you don't have data to say something, then we don't want to hear you to talk. And once you have data, we want to know what we can conclude from the data. We don't care, right? We really don't care what you think, right? So many of us are in environments similar to the one I was in where we're conditioned to either not trust our voice or we're not really invited to bring it into the conversation. And what I've learned in transition is that the one common denominator is we need to make room for, this truth, whatever it is. And by the way, it isn't just a binary thing like, okay, I'm going to wake up today and voila, I'm going to turn my truth on. There's a very funny story. I remember I did this lovely event in Chicago for these nonprofit leaders, and after I talked for a couple hours, one lady came up to me in tears, and she said, my goodness, she said, I can hear my voice screaming at me. She went on to say, she was terrified because the consequences that she perceives in acting in alignment with her voice overwhelming. So she was frozen. And so this notion of voice is multidimensional, right? We know it, and then we have to decide to act in alignment with it. And I remember there was another lady who came up right after that same presentation, and she stood next to this woman who was in tears, and she put her hand above her eyebrow, and then she looked from left to right as if she was like a seafarer looking for a distant land. She's like, voice? She said, I haven't seen my voice in 30 years. So, I say that because, voice is something we can talk about, and if we spent 5 minutes, we could find 10 places online talking about voice. But I share those stories to say that there's real work in understanding voice and in what it is for us. And I do think that's, we go through multiple iterations, which, you've referenced Rick and others that you read. Life isn't about one stop, like, okay, voila, we're going to go through transition and then we're done.
Right.
It's an iterative process that, it may take decades. But, our willingness to start is important. And most of the people who I interviewed in my research said, once they began, was such an enlivening process, they continued. So their first disruption might have been about an occupation or a relationship. Once they began, they welcomed it in other areas and thinking of that occupied their entire self. I think that's really the invitation that is coming to us when we encounter a disruption, is we're being invited to explore our voice for who we are and our willingness to share that with others.
One thing is I've talked about to a couple of friends about what I want to do on the show this week, and I've been talking about your voice, and inevitably, you know what comes up, Linda? What if you have a negative voice?
Yeah.
What if you have that self-talk that is going to restrict your growth and this beautiful transition? How do you overcome that or silence that voice to bring the voice of, I believe in essential goodness. I don't believe in, you don't know much about me, but I'm a pretty strong Christian man, but not in today's terms. I follow the late medieval Christian mystics, and it's a very different approach. But it is confining if you're not careful, and we turn to that voice which just wants to scream out how you were unworthy. Look at what you just did. You're a sinner. You're horrible. You're unworthy. And if that, that's a voice that comes out in a lot of people. How do we manage that voice?
And thank you so much for bringing that up, because it is such a common accompaniment to this process of disruption and choosing to move forward. And that's why in the book I spend a fair amount of time introducing reframing technique, which allows us to, we don't want to tamp down the emotions, right? Okay, so negativity is here, maybe we're self-critical. It isn't necessarily to bypass that. We want to honor the fact that it's here. We want to reframe it so it isn't oppositional to our desire to get closer to our truth, our new truth, if you will, our expanded truth. And so the notion of negativity, how do I get close to my voice with negativity? It's to make sure that you practice these techniques to help you externalize, right? To be with that negativity in a new way. Because that gives you the runway. I often describe it to people like, there's a real criticality that I learned as a young child. And, a rigid kind of, I want to say perfectionism, but, anything I did was never right. And so that's with me a lot. And on days when I'm, not paying attention, it's as if that kind of emotion, that criticality is a rope that I'm hanging onto the end of, and it can flick me around willy-nilly, change directions, and I have no control. Like, it is total power over how I show up on some days. But if I learn to adopt the techniques of kind of reframing that, what it helps me do is criticality doesn't disappear, but I can drop that rope on the ground next to me, right? So its power over me is completely diffused.
Right.
So I can continue to think and be and explore what I need to do and still not bypass it. Because, there are a lot of techniques out there that say, okay, when you feel angry, sad, upset, concerned, fearful, don't think that, think X, right? We learn to bypass emotion. And the risk in that is that we train ourselves to distrust ourselves. And that's why we never want to do that, right? We really want to do our best to stay away from that. And that's why in the book I spend so much time on teaching us how to reframe, right? So isn't that I'm going to judge myself, that criticism is so much a part of who I am. It's, I want to honor the fact that's a part of me. I want to not allow it to have power over me. And that's how I would respond to your friend about voice and this notion that, well, negativity is present. I can't even have a conversation about this. I would say we're going to start with really trying to reframe.
Yes.
That are accompanying you.
Yes.
And then once we do, we can ask ourselves different questions. And that's all of it is this really lovely opening to new ways of thinking about ourselves and the world.
Oh, that's beautiful. I was taking a course on first and second half of life, and the instructor talked about the importance of sacred wounds and necessary suffering. And many of the things that we are critical about ourselves and that makes us a bad person are somehow in competition with social norm, and that we don't fit social norm, and so therefore if we don't fit social norm, we're not a member of this group or that group. And what the instructor Richard talks about in this, it's important to recognize these sacred wounds as instruments of growth, that this woundedness from our negative self-talk gives us, if we use correctly, gives us an opportunity to view an alternative, to say, now that obviously can't work, there's got to be something else going on.
I will tell you, I completely agree with. I'm hesitant. I don't know all the things that you are being taught about that, but this notion of honoring all of our experiences, and each have something we can draw from to inform where we're headed. We don't want to be past focused in that we don't want the past to define our future path. We sure would like to be informed by it, because there is a real richness to the wisdom that comes out of that. And in the book, I talk a lot about questions that we can ask ourselves to kind of get at what I think you're referring to as sacred wounds, right? We ask ourselves about, like an emotion like despair that comes up. The book encourages us through reflections in every chapter to recognize what meaning despair, if that's the emotion, holds in our life, to not through judgment, but to open ourselves to recognize what the linkages are in our experience about despair. And then it in a very generous and supportive way draws us to considering what we might learn in the presence of despair, right?
Right.
Again, unique in our experience, and it goes to this notion that says, again, we're not going to judge. Just going to say, okay, let's just consider for a moment there's an opportunity that this might be present for us, help us learn something. Might that be? And it's fascinating. I've done this with so many people, Charlie. It's fascinating what people come up with.
I have. I'm going to hold a class on. It's for people who are pursuing sort of Christian mysticism, and the class is The Benefits of Sin, and how our brokenness guides us into the grace of a loving Creator, and drives us into, okay, maybe I can alter some of my behaviors, maybe I can't, but I can alter some of my behaviors, and so that's helpful. Now, what I want to, I'm looking to kind of come to a close here. However, I have some notes on we are our own first audience, and I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and I'm going to let you comment it in one section. So here are my notes, and tell me if they're in line with what you think, and if there's anything that sparks the creative insight of Linda Rossetti. And these are this: our voice is a sense of self-expression. This is our truest and deepest core. It is the essence of our inmost essence. It is the essence of our inmost being and truth. And I like this. Virtue is not an advisor, or not virtue. Voice is not an advisor, but more of a reminder of our purest nature. The voice that we want to turn the volume up is not an advisor, but we're reminding others, and we're reminding ourselves of our purest nature. And then I have this: if your voice is abusive, it's not your true self, it's a false self that is sort of a perversion of your true self. And my final statement: transition requires turning up the volume on your own voice. Now, that's a whole podcast right there. But
I love it all. I love it all, and
well, it's coming right from you, so.
Well, I clearly am biased, but I do think that this notion of turning up the volume on our own voice is something we can all hold in our heart, and I really appreciate your willingness to talk about, some of our own self-judgment, right? When we say, well, we're broken or flawed, or we've had some terrible experience, and therefore we're defined by that. I think that in my work, so many people came in having had trauma, and it's something that I've learned that through transition we can learn to reframe that trauma and understand how even in an odd sense is a gift, can allow us to give that much more to those around us.
And the important thing about turning up your voice, because when I first heard it, I was thinking it's turning up your voice in your social context, but it's really much more of turning up your voice to your inner self, giving credence to what is value to you, and that you are repeating that is your voice, that is your essence. Now you can share it with the world, but you have to first own it.
Very true.
Linda Rossetti, you're amazing. And one more thing before we close. I understand you teach people about this, and you have a coaching certification process. Can you tell us about this? Because I think more people, could benefit by working with you on this.
Yes, so I offer a certification course for coaches or advisors or social workers that work with others navigating disruption and transition, and really uses my research and the methods. It goes beyond the methods that are introduced in the book, but it's centered on a lot of the themes that are in the book. And people who are interested, you can find out at my website, lindarossetti.com, has all the information.
Okay.
And,
okay.
And it's an exciting time. We are in our society faced with an accelerating amount of disruption everywhere, right? From our economy to technology to our notions of society and culture and faith and all sorts of things. And so my suspicion is a capacity to navigate disruption is critical. So that's the reason why I teach other coaches, so that we can really educate more people to be successful at this, because it's not going away.
Yeah, this is a direction of life in the next new age, which we're in right now. I so appreciate that. So, Linda Rossetti, this has been a very fast hour, and in my mind, a brilliant conversation. You and I could talk deeply for hours, and if I drank, we'd probably have a bottle of wine. But I just, I want to thank you so much for being willing to be a guest on the show and offer us such valuable insight.
Charlie, it's been my absolute pleasure. Thank you for inviting me. I've loved the conversation, and I wish the best to you and all your listeners.
How kind of you. Thank you, Linda. You're the best. All right. I want to thank all our listeners for tuning into the next chapter with Charlie. Until next, this is Charlie Hedges signing off. Bye for now.